was considered quite heretical within the framework of the psychodynamic, psychoanalytic Tavistock, to set up a program which was not going to be based on teaching those principles.
As part of the marking of the Tavistock Clinic's 100th anniversary, it seems timely to trace and celebrate the development of systemic therapy here at the clinic, which has so often been rendered invisible, and whose contribution to the systemic psychotherapy field as a whole and to mental health and social care services in the UK has been so significant.
Rosemary Whiffen had just come back from America, and so she was full of beans about family work. She did some work with the Ackerman and worked in some projects in New York City. And she was all fired by these ideas. There was Byng Hall. John had a family model. Frida Martin was a Canadian psychiatrist and Jungian psychiatrist, but also very interested in family work. It had the status of a workshop. That's all it was. It met once a week. But then about that time, John and Rosemary and Frida were talking about setting up a training. So this would have been about 74.
Okay.
And John and Rosemary were going to chair this new training course, and Frida Martin was the chair of the C&F department, so she was going to kind of give it the space and fight for it within the timetable of the Tavistock's program. And they were a formidable threesome.
Well, the Sheldon training was set up by Rosemary Whiffen, who was an incredibly energetic woman and gave us all an inspiration of how to use our own energy. So she got X £1,000 per student for a fellowship called Sheldon via a trust with her colleague John Barrett, which she used to convince the Tavistock that it wouldn't do anything except benefit from having this course and have the students come and attend it.
So once that got going, then the whole, all the paraphernalia of the one-way screens and the having clinical referrals coming through intake and having a teaching program, supervision groups, live supervision groups. I was put into a supervision group with Rosemary Whiffen,
Right.
and along with Tessa Jowl, and also in that cohort, that very first Sheldon cohort, was Gill Gorell Barnes.
Yes.
And in the early days, we were all completely dominated by psychoanalytic, psychodynamic thinking. And what was curious about that was that we came in with a mix of models which included group analytic thinking, which, because I'd worked with Robin Skinner for 3 or 4 years by then, I said to Rosemary, we need some relevant reading, and she said, well, you'll have to help me construct some reading.
But then in the 74, 75, we made a connection with the Ackerman Institute in New York.
Yeah.
And we had joint conferences where the Ackerman staff came over and worked alongside us, and we tried to promote family therapy as an ongoing model in the UK.
Rosemary had what was probably a very good idea, which was to bring over each year a new visitor from the States who'd been doing family work in the States.
I mean, what I remember in those early years is that fashions came and went. That, every year we had a number of overseas visitors, and it might be Donald Block, it might be Peggy Papp, it might be Olga Silverstein, and then Marianne Walters came for a year, and we had great fun. Sal Minuchin came.
The really influential people for me in terms of teaching were Harriet Ponte, who came and did a month with us, and she was brilliant at taking the precise nuance of a transaction or an interaction and helping the family look at it and think about what it meant in a very gentle way. And we had very funny groups because some of those people were already very psychoanalytically oriented. Some of them were quite shocked. And one of the immortal phrases I heard coming from my left when Marianne Walters was teaching us was vagina dentata, as she made some structural intervention which they didn't approve of and they felt was castrating. And we had to be very respectful, I think, because of the precarious position, of the family systems program. And it was
family therapists make a lot of noise, yes? They go around in groups, they work in groups. And it was quite unacceptable at the beginning to the child psychotherapists, and we were quite unpopular. Again, this was a process, but you have to remember we were in a Kleinian environment and, being very quiet and no noise in the corridor. And suddenly there were these groups of people who were all so excited about what they were doing.
What I think we did as a systems group in a very serious institution is we had a lot of fun.
But I think there's something quite serious about it, because I think that the family therapists had incorporated quite a lot of playfulness in the teaching, in the clinical work, and that is slightly different from the way some of the other therapies.
Yes.
And I think that's one of the reasons I thought it was so valuable as a meta-commentary on everything else we did, to be able to take a humorous position, and reflect on ourselves through humour. You see, I think Bateson provided an umbrella to start with, which enabled one to link all kinds of ideas. So curiosity is a huge part of the work, and I think that then makes you want to link with other theories and see how you can make use of them and so on. I, for example, was always interested in linking any family work to whether or not the family could understand what on earth we were doing and why we were doing it, where you could actually say to the family, did that make sense? As I was trying to bring that attention to the structures of family life and the way the child developed within those different structures, but also working with the child's imaginary capacity in short-term work. And then, of course, I was also doing it. I was having a family with young children, and so I was living the experience that I was also working with, which I think actually is one of my hallmarks.
Yes. Gill's ways of thinking and Gill's ways of incorporating ideas from sociology, from social policy, from that kind of thinking, was very close to the way I have both kind of wanted to develop systemic thinking myself. So I've always appreciated the way she was able to locate practice in the context of what was happening societally. That meant a lot to me.
I think a lot of people felt that was taking away from family therapy theory and its development. Rosemary would have wanted to work more the way that I was thinking of working.
And Rosie was extraordinarily sharp and really good at helping you think about what you were doing in the session. And that kind of whole way in which you use all of yourself, your voice, your body, all the communication you have available, was something she was so good at. And she was a really formidable clinician, but also she was a good thinker.
John would have wanted to work more with intergenerational models, which were linked also obviously more to psychoanalytic connections. John Bowlby. But John was a very benign figure in the early days, and he was very generous with his thinking. He would make the papers available. He would actually come down the corridor and say, here is what I've written.
John Bowlby was really the first family therapist, I always say, because he appreciated and he first talked about the importance of seeing families together.
John Byng Hall, I think, gained a lot from Bowlby. John tried to integrate attachment theory into his work, but he was also a very benign figure, and I think that the men who trained found John Byng Hall very important. Because
he was a great artist in the room, but he dug deep, but he knew by the time he got to 10 minutes before the end, something would have happened.
And we were doing all these experiential exercises. We did family sculpting, so we would sculpt the family. Rosemary was very keen on this. It was one of the things I think she brought from the States. Someone would volunteer, and then they'd be forced to pick a moment in time and place the family around them in relation to that moment, and then everyone would be interviewed about what they were feeling. And we would do role play in relation to actually family interview techniques, but we would also do role play in relation to aspects of family living. Homosexuality as a criminal act had only been repealed at the end of the 60s, and that hadn't entered the thinking of family therapy training. I don't think we paid nearly enough attention to ethnicity and diversity. I think I did bring in an emphasis on working with fathers, and I do think that was so missing in child psychology generally. Being able to look at film of what you were doing was such a bonus for learning, and that's one of the really innovative things that John and Rosie created as part of the training. And I think we all just, it was terrifying, but it was wonderful. And I think that was probably a revolution in terms of giving people a means of reflecting on themselves and their own work. And it allows you to use your critical brain as well as your emotional self, and then think about that in a safe place away from the actual family, and then come back to it in a different way. It gave a way of developing a supervisory conversation that was tremendously interesting, because everyone could participate in the thinking in a non-threatening way. But of course we worked quite a lot to start with having a conversation in the room in front of the family, which I also actually think was I liked it. I thought it was very, very transparent. It set up a structure in which it was possible for people to experience themselves as trainers and also have a place to discuss being trainers, so that there was supervision at 2 levels. And I think that was what was new about it, really, wasn't it?
So in 1980 I joined the Child and Family Department, and in those days there were different programs within the Child and Family Department, and I was based in the Education Service. And so I decided to develop my own creative way of using family therapy and systemic ideas with families who presented with an educational problem. And we set up this service, and we looked at the interactions of those families. We also started systemic interventions in schools, and then further on down the line we developed a project which we call Taking the Clinic to School. We really thought that we would get away from the kind of long-term therapy model, and we would offer 3 sessions. I can't tell you how rewarding this work was. And the main thing was that the parents didn't feel they were going to a clinic, to a psychiatric service. They were coming to school, where all children went to school and all parents went. So we were very excited about that it brought together the 2 streams of systemic thinking that was happening completely separate. Schools with Bob Burden and all the educational psychologists thinking about the individual and the school system, never mentioned families. And the family therapists thinking about the individual in the family, very rarely mentioning schools.
I had taught a foundation year for maybe 3 or 4 years, and then the intermediate year, and I didn't want to go on teaching a foundation year, so I put to the group maybe it would be useful to have something like teaching practice as part of the programme, and that's how teaching practice module became part of the programme.
The terrifyingness of having to start to teach when you were still training, but boy did it make you own the ideas.
Absolutely.
In a way that you realised they hadn't quite.
Yeah. But the best way
Try.
to learn is to teach, as we know.
I think Ros was extraordinarily creative in the way she helped us think about not just how to teach systemic ideas, but much more important, how to teach in a systemic way.
We all took up the Milan model, but some of us actually would have enjoyed taking up more the Pap Silverstein women talking collaboratively model, because I found that, I thought it was really brilliant. That early paper on the Greek chorus was just lovely. And of course we did do some of that, Charlotte, I think.
Yeah, we did.
If we came on to Milan, that had it was a sort of huge change, wasn't it? It was a second order change. It was a bouleversement, really, of the way theory was thought about, and it captured people's imaginations in a way that the structural model had somehow not. And I think that was to do, again, with its abstraction.
The trigger was the book, Paradox and Counterparadox.
Okay.
When the book came out, I devoured it like a monk reading some medieval manuscript, sentence by sentence. I got very excited intellectually because I think it was the first time I could see systemic ideas being transferred into the practice of therapy, so that you could ask circular questions, or you could gossip in the presence of, and you could do these things, and there was an intellectual conceptual rationale from systems theory about why that should work, why that should help people to see context, how it should help people to see themselves getting feedback. And so you got the theory and the practice, and they came together.
You know, that there is an emotional logic to the symptom, and coming from that is positive connotation and obviously paradoxical interventions. And there was for a number of years there was a lot of questioning about the ethics of that. I mean, Tom Anderson hadn't kind of come yet on board with the reflecting team and the kind of transparency piece.
Yeah.
But that made a big difference. In 81, I think David and I had had a visit from Gianfranco and Luigi. I think we wanted to immerse ourselves in Milan systemic therapy, and it was not what the program was doing.
Ros Draper and I were both very interested in the Paradox and Counterparadox book. We were given 3 trainees. We would have the pre-session discussions, and we'd have the reflecting team, and then we'd have post-session, and we tried to really ape the model as much as we could. We were very careful about technique and so on. That was a very creative group with lots of energy.
We had this year with Elsa, Peter Lang, Martin, and Sebastian, where there was a discussion group in which everybody was completely brilliant all the time. Martin Little and Peter Lang took what they'd learned and set up Kensington Consultation Centre. Yeah. It had a huge impact on training.
We had a visit from Chaki, and he did some consultations, and somehow that was for me transformational.
Caroline Lindsey was also on the staff here, but she came along and said, "Look, I'm really interested in this as well. Why don't we work together?" We decided to set up a training course that would match the 2-year qualification course that John and Rosie had to set up. So that created a lot of tension and a lot of bad feeling for a year or so. I think that John and Rosemary felt a little bit betrayed that we were going off on our own tangent.
And then we got the division of loyalties, didn't we? did we go with John or did we go with David? And that was probably quite painful.
Rosemary and John, they wouldn't stop you from doing anything. And it also was linked to the development of family therapy in England, in Britain.
Yeah.
And they wanted to promote that at all costs.
We felt that there was a dedication to the intellectual project here, and that we were only going to develop that if we were on our own. Plus, there's the issue of us wanting to have our own career spaces and not to be under their shadows.
I still remember how scared I was about the idea of sitting in front of a screen and remembering to be curious, but most important, to ask questions. It was incredibly difficult because we hadn't been working that way. Their transition from psychoanalysis to systemic work was an extraordinary leap, and which was based for them, as you know, on the fact that there were all these families that they felt just you couldn't treat with psychoanalysis. You had to be a different way. It was a very important learning thing. It was about accepting people as they are and trying to see their perspective. And I think that the whole thing about the circularity and asking these circular questions, which allowed people for the first time to get another perspective on somebody else, was so important. You know, the joy when somebody could say, I never saw it like that. You know, and you knew then that you'd done something important. It shifted the perspective. And of course, also, you remember the fact that we had our final message, which we put together, that people actually went away with something from the session that we had put together, especially sometimes with the reflecting team, depending on what we were doing, that gave them a message about how we saw it on the basis of what they told them. I think developing that was a very important period in the life of the development of the Milan method.
I felt that the way in which they used this, come unto us, tell us your woes and your sins, and we will make a pronouncement. I thought it was so based on Catholicism, not on patriarchy so much as Catholicism, and that really annoyed me, actually.
It felt as if so there was all these relationships outside, but actually something like emotions just simply was relegated to the internal domain and therefore not really of our interest to write about, because of course we used them all the time. Just like the Milan school were, you know, incredibly emotionally attuned, but they never really wrote about whether that mattered or what that meant.
Some of the things that we were kind of challenging in the period of time that we were training, and I think probably the main area, which won't surprise anybody to hear, is that you and I were very hot on bringing feminism and bringing understandings of gender into family therapy, which really was within the Tavistock completely absent. I don't think, not that other people were not thinking about it, because of course there was Elsa Jones who trained there and who'd done a lot of thinking, but generally in terms of the training it was not reflected at all. And we both did dissertations on feminism and family therapy.
In the 1980s, we all went through a lot of retraining in our thinking about diversity, and that wasn't happening particularly at the Tavistock. It was happening throughout family therapy, I think, and throughout
social
services.
The whole issue of culture, race, culture and power, which in many ways I think was more of a struggle because there was so much less representation. So for at least there were just as many women teaching as men, so it was possible to have more of a voice for women, even though some women definitely chose not to take up that kind of voice. But I think for challenging race and culture, that was much more of a struggle.
Because the Milan people had gone back to Bateson and Slavic and MRI, you can think systemically at many different levels. and intervened very differently at different levels. And of course, most of the people who came to train on the courses or came to a workshop were working in the public sector in complicated systems. And we found this, we could offer them tools and ways of thinking.
I gradually began to feel that there was too much of an emphasis on the technique of the interviewing. I think what I tried to do was to soften the model a little bit and develop a model that was more responsive to families and to the feeling tone in the room and things like that. So I was looking for something that would also take the Milan model forward, let it evolve and develop. And Ros Draper and I did that book about the applications of the systemic, of the Milan model, and apply these ideas to how organizations change and how they develop, which I think there was tremendous potential there that hadn't been tapped into.
We had started doing consultations in organisations, both public sector and private sector. And that came out of recognising that this way of thinking was useful in any organisation. It made us realise we were learning something about theories of change as well. What's really interesting, unless you're willing to language things in a non-therapy language, you will not get people from organisations engaged with the ideas. We started talking about, well, what is the highest context marker here? What's the one thing that needs to happen now before anything else can happen in this system? What's the feedback we're getting? And those were very empowering ways of thinking. We wrote and self-published in the mid to late 80s the first 3 books. Second Thoughts on the Milan Approach, Teaching Systemic Thinking, and Development Consultation. Those were the first 3. And then Harry Carnac approached us and said he would be interested in taking it over, which was music to our ears at the time. Well, yeah, we definitely created a niche, as you know.
Second order cybernetics became more prominent, and I remember getting very excited about the work of von Forster and the circle of people that were trying to interpret him. To put the therapist in the center of the process rather than observing the family with a problem, I thought was a real leap. And I always go back to, I think it was Lynn Hoffman's phrase that, where she said that we used to think that the family had the problem, and now we think that the problem has a system around it. And that was a very seminal idea that, to me, represented turning a corner.
So, to my mind, some of the systemic practitioners went wildly social constructionist, and I've always felt that isn't a solution. It did have this good outcome that we began to be more interested in self, as it were, and therefore perhaps interrogating that a bit more.
If you follow a social constructionist model and you're interested in how people construct meanings, that's where I would start from. So I would just keep asking the question, well, how can we help people construct meanings together? As a therapist, how could I enact this? How could I bring it into the therapy room or the organizational consulting room? So then I began to think, well, how is it that people, let's strip this down a little bit. How do people need to talk to each other and listen? And then that took me into the world of the dialogical approach, and took me into a very different area. And I began to study rules of dialogue, and that led me toward positioning theory, and that if you can appreciate the positions people are coming from and use that as the basis of a dialogue, then you've got some really good tools that you can use as a therapist or as a consultant.
What do you think distinguishes your approach to consultation to organisations from, for example, the Tavistock? You know, in the Tavistock they've got a very kind of psychoanalytic approach.
In terms of organizational process, I think it's more helpful to work with a model of helping people listen differently, communicate differently, to talk about differences, to talk about difficult things that are getting swept under the carpet, and that they need help and they need structures to be able to do that, rather than just somebody saying that's what's going on. I think my approach is more based in the present and leaning into the future. So I would be more interested in thinking of what structures can you set up, what kind of conversations can you have within the organization that will help you solve these problems.
I suppose discovering meaning and discovering social construction was such a sort of big event in systemic psychotherapy. But coming from a social anthropological background, you can't do ethnography or be a social anthropologist with already having some sort of entanglement with meaning and the complexity of it. Complex process of trying to take account of not just the assumptions I make, but the assumptions I don't make, and what the history of those are. And therefore, what are the roots of some of my foundational concepts, that I've taken this vehicle of cross-cultural work all the time and tried to put that in the center.
For me, one of the most exciting things has been the bringing in of voices from social psychology, sociology, and discourse analysis. Just completely opens up a whole framework for understanding our social worlds differently.
We created the systems group, and it was before the discipline became a discipline. And actually it was very fortunate that we were not a discipline, because we didn't have to be split in different services. We could be together, and that was the 80s and 90s.
1987, we joined Brunel University, and that was the first family therapy course that had academic recognition in the country. And it was based at Brunel, and people got an MSc then for their 2-year qualification course. And it was also the first academically recognized Tavistock course. So we were the guinea pigs for the whole Tavi. And John and Rosemary asked me if I would take that on and be the chair of that course. It was a little bit tough because I knew that some of the people in the Tavi looked down on the systemic courses and the systemic discipline, and yet there we were going first into the firing line, taking the flak, and trying things out. So I was proud that we were doing that.
I think I suppose it was quite important that somebody with my background, with my interests, became chair in a department which until then had only had really, I think it would be true to say, a psychoanalytic approach, even though not all the chair people had been necessarily psychoanalysts, but that was the way of thinking. So there was Robin Anderson was the chair of the adolescent department, who's a psychoanalyst, and Anton was the chief executive, and Rob Hale was chair of the Portman. And so I stood out for all kinds of reasons. I was a woman, very important. As a woman, I was Jewish, and I was a family therapist. It didn't matter. I had other analytic trainings. That was who I was. And we all got on pretty well together and were able to gel together and used our different perspectives to make quite a cohesive whole. Anton was very good at holding things together. Development of a special team for families who were fostering and adopting. And maybe the most important thing was, which one could only really recognize from a systemic perspective, was the differences of family life for adoption and fostering, and that when people came to work with such families with the perspective that they were just like any other family, that was very damaging to the families that came. Fundamental beliefs that people have about family functioning had to be altered in order to work. That is where the systemic perspective played a very important part in the development of such a resource, and was the only resource that at the time for these families.
Being able to look at and work with the systems around the children, as well as what the children might have experienced, and with that felt important, but it was very much a systemic group. And Rita was there as a systemic psychotherapist, I was there, and then eventually I became the team, I suppose what became called a manager, but the team lead. So we would work in pairs, or on the whole the family therapists would work in pairs, but also we would use a screen, so different trainees would join, so we would have a multidisciplinary group working together with a family. So again, you could use it as a kind of teaching opportunity, but also a way to hear one another's ideas.
I worked, as you know, for many years in the fostering, adoption, kinship care team, and in that team I think we had, because the situations were very complex, we often worked with families over quite a period of time because of the nature of the work and the nature of the experiences that the client group had had, that it felt absolutely essential really to draw on more than one modality, that one modality was just not enough. And that there were times when a psychoanalytic approach, particularly perhaps for children who had a lot of difficult experiences pre-verbally, that child psychotherapy methodology was particularly helpful at reaching the places that more language-based or more action-based psychotherapies perhaps didn't reach. And that particular experience of co-working with a lot of child psychotherapists in the room with a family, I think we all found, the whole team found, very valuable, and there was a lot of cross-fertilization in the here and now of the work in the room. And that was just such a creative way of working.
We decided to merge the two courses again and place the emphasis more on the supervisor and the quality of supervision that you get.
We were all doing something on the master's course, and so that connected us, and we met and we thought about developing the courses. It felt if you were part of something.
We felt that there was a need, and it was very exciting, and we developed the methodology as well. Us supervising people supervising, you remember, because we were doing something new, and it was quite a responsibility actually, sitting behind the screen and working out. Do you remember working out when we should allow the person to do that, or when we should intervene and how we should intervene? And of course, the reflexive approach was very important. The discussions was crucial, wasn't it?
So in 1993, I set up the first, it was called the Tavistock Burck, the clinical PhD in child and family psychology, which was the first clinical PhD in the UK. giving clinicians the opportunity to do high quality research in the context of a Tavistock course, because I always felt that PhD students had to do their research in solitary confinement, just them and their supervisor. And I wanted to create a context where students who were already very gifted clinicians could develop research to the highest academic qualification. And that was a very successful course, but it petered out when the professional doctorates came into force.
The reason we thought it was a good idea to set up the doctorate was to offer a place for people to come and do research around their clinical preoccupations, because there wasn't really any other place to do that.
But I always thought it was a good model to offer something to people who'd been in the field for a long time and therefore had developed particular interest in a topic and a huge amount of clinical experience. Part of our job was to orient people to thinking as a researcher and not as a clinician, and that was a lot of the preparatory early teaching was around that. You are curious in a different kind of way. It frees them to stand back from their own clinical sort of commitments and habits, and they can step outside that. And that was really lovely, seeing people get to that point, I think.
And you could see their practice changing. Yeah. It changed more profoundly than when they came to train.
No,
as family therapists.
I completely agree.
We set up the Family Therapy and Systemic Research Centre to offer a wider systemic research community for the doctorate and to collect research references to make a database that would be available not only for the doctorate and the masters, but for the wider public and the whole systemic field.
In the 90s, when we set up these research stroke system groups, we took a theme in which we were applying systemic thinking to an area. Each student had to have a project. We did a post-divorce group.
We used to meet on Thursday morning, see a family together, either Gill and I or with one of the students. The others will be behind the screen. They were from different courses, not just the family therapy training, and they were all doing dissertations in related subjects. So we had a body of research coming out of that group, which was very exciting. My particular interest was always the children's perspective and helping them to construct a coherent story of their experience.
We moved on to really looking at the qualities of the divorce that made it difficult for children. That's what the Divorce Project was about.
Stephen Frosch and I conducted a group exploring qualitative methodologies to research the process of change in systemic therapy. So using discourse analysis, we discovered that over the course of the therapy, there was an increase in the varieties of discourses which families drew on to describe themselves and their situation. Renos Papadopoulos and Judy Hildebrand worked on a research project interviewing Bosnian refugee families to explore their dilemmas. They found home was a highly complex idea, with many torn between two homes, back there and here. Home is as much where the heart is as the heart is where the home is.
I was really keen to focus on the challenges that families were experiencing when an adult or child was really ill. Barbara Dale said she would be very happy to join me, and John Byng Hall, who struggled with disabilities himself, said he really wanted to focus on this area too. So almost all families where mother or father had a life-limiting condition, and struggled to think of why, and then realized that actually that was to do with the fact that in pediatric settings at that time, people were thinking families, but it was very rare for people to think families if a mother or father was diagnosed with something life-threatening. You know, we also ran a sort of brainstorming group with some of the students. And because we were all focusing on illness and we were all interested in it, we were that extra bit committed to thinking about their research, but we learned a huge amount from them. One of the things about John, the disabilities he had coming out of polio were evident for everyone to see. But I think he actually used his transparency in a really creative way. I mean, his transparency as an insider to what Susan Sontag would call the world of the ill as opposed to the world of the healthy. And I remember him seeing a young boy at one point who had had surgery across his head. And he did, well, admittedly, he's a doctor, but he did what I could never have done. But he ran his hand over the scar. And it was actually a very positive experience for the young man. Yes. And I think this is something hugely important that's happened to you and happened to your body, and they're not separate entities. You know, that whole embodied experience that I think was just so important.
You and Barbara went on to volunteer to do the talking cure.
Barbara was the person who was seeing the family in front of the screen. And I think one of the most important things was, at one point she said something, but what about the loss? And that really opened up something else. Also, once she herself had cancer, although she didn't actually talk about this with clients, she just brought a depth of knowledge, depth of wisdom. And I think one of the things about Barbara is she also loved laughing. You know, she loved having a joke. We were also very aware of the challenges healthcare professionals face in working with families at this time. And so I set up a course for healthcare professionals but they were primarily hospital-based, on working with families facing all forms of illness.
And some years earlier, Emilia Dowling had started to go into GP practices.
There was an initiative in what was called Hampstead Health Authority at the time about psychologists going into general practice. But the idea was the general practitioners were expecting the psychologist to go and sit in a room and run a smoking clinic or a weight loss program or something like that. But we thought we want to work collaboratively with the GP. And we found a very enlightened GP in Camden, Caroline Days, and Valerie Golding and I worked with her, and we effectively used a reflecting team in her consulting room with one another in front of the patient. We had no one-way screen, no cameras, but we worked like that.
John Lorna was a GP who was very interested in psychotherapy, and he came and did the Milan training. What he became focused on was the importance of bringing the ideas of systemic working to general practice. After all, when we think that, we are a very small group of people, relatively speaking, in our profession, whether it's psychiatry or psychology or family therapy. And there are vast numbers of family doctors seeing vast numbers of people without TFL tools to do the work in a way that would be therapeutic. And he persuaded me that we should consider starting a course for doctors and nurses on allied professions, basically. But these were quite important people. Some of these were trainers of GPs who came. That was very exciting to try and think about how you could use the systemic ideas that we use in family therapy in the 10-minute interview that a doctor has to see the patient. And there were some very useful questions, which was, what's the most important thing we need to speak about, which of course is what we do also, but it's not something that is said in an interview with the doctor, and how to work out which of the many things on their agenda we need to understand, and how to take a position of understanding the story that connects all the symptoms that they brought. And it developed like that, and it became very successful. He has since developed his own ideas. He's very keen on narrative general practice.
The family therapists at the Tavistock took part in an international depression study, which was coordinated by Judith Trowl and Professor Izzy Colby. And it spanned across 3 European cities, London, Athens and Helsinki. And it was a very exciting project, which compared family therapy and individual child psychotherapy with parent work for children with childhood depression. David Campbell, Sarah Barrett, myself and Renos Papadopoulos. We were the 4 therapists who had a supervisory role.
My primary interest would always be in the clinical process and how can we look at that, not get too far removed from it as researchers. So the methodology of significant well-being, and they try to identify key moments that families and therapists identify. And I thought that was a really good, fairly accessible research model.
The fight to get family therapy established as a profession, and it was quite a fight.
Caroline, we had some very good women and men who kind of really worked hard. Because you were so well respected in the institution as well, people couldn't silence you really, and also you had reputations outside. So I think that, but also that kind of persistent, not giving up was something that was so important. I think a huge achievement that we were recognised, and there were some very good people like Margaret Rustin and people who supported that. It was just so ironic that we were one of the big trainings for systemic psychotherapists in the country, and we weren't allowed to call ourselves systemic psychotherapists. So it was a huge achievement, and well, I had realised the fight there had been, but I didn't realise quite the animosity that continued. So it was very difficult. The first professional committee I went to, which was a room full of strangers, because most people worked in other departments, and I knew there was an atmosphere, but of course I didn't know what that was. And I think, I've told you that I sat down and introduced myself and said, I'm Sarah Barrett, I'm head of systemic psychotherapy. And the person sitting next to me said, oh, I thought systemic and psychotherapy were a contradiction in terms. So that was my greeting on my first day. It was a fairly terrifying experience, I think, to go in and know that there was an atmosphere, and perhaps people hadn't really wanted you to have a place at the table.
I think that feeling of systemic therapy bedding down into the teams in children and families, not always comfortably, and family therapists were part of every team and had quite a strong presence in the clinical life of the Tavistock.
As a development consultant for race and equity, had to do with the rather simplistic view of race and ethnicity in systemic psychotherapy. So there was something about the complexity of that I could bring to the work in the Tavistock. I'm not sure what the Tavistock generally thought about having a systemic psychotherapist in that role as a development and training consultant, because of course that role was very difficult. There's so much resistance to trying to pick up anything either Agnes, who was my working partner, or I said. And, we both got stick. There's absolutely no reference to the work we did from the management in the Tavistock now that they're picking up Black Lives Matter. In fact, they're probably kind of gone back, because it was quite an innovative idea of the Tavistock to engage us too at a high level and give us a sort of full range of run of the place.
But I think one of the things I was quite pleased about was to try and recruit a more diverse staff group.
A position opened up at the Tavistock at what was then the Asian service, so a culturally and linguistically matched service. It was mostly a Sylheti-speaking Bangladeshi population in Camden, is that we would just do community home visits. It was one of the ways in which we were doing things that were quite different to what was happening in the clinic, but also, thinking a lot about the issues of cultural matching or not, linguistic matching or not, thinking about how differently families were constructed, which then led to my doctoral dissertation.
Coming back in 2000, I certainly felt that there was a completely different atmosphere around how issues of diversity, power and difference were talked about. But it always felt like a struggle, clearly, because it always is a struggle.
I was involved with overseeing D4, and that was in 2005 and 2006. And actually, I carried on doing that until 2009, which is when I started co-leading the M6 with Kate Daniel. And D4, I think, is just such a vibrant and such an important course.
It's just like, well, you've got these 2 sessions, Yvonne, I think you could be running D4 with Rini. Those days, we did things together. A lot more co-teaching, a lot more co-managing, and that was about 2006-07. I took over running D4, and I had established tutors who were visiting lecturers, consisted of Jane Dutton, Sharon Bond, who I knew, and Vince Hesketh. And I thought as a trio, they were very nice to work with. One of the things I learned there was around how, at the time, how some people struggled to take our authority as Black course leads. And there was a woman, a psychologist, who wanted to APEL, and she'd written a very poor essay. So I said to, she got the feedback that the essay wasn't very good, and really she had to either resubmit or she did year 1. She was so angry, she came up to London on a hot August day to have a meeting with me to discuss it. And I did say to her, would you be doing this if I were white? Would you come all this way to have the discussion if I were white? She was too shocked to reply, as I expected, which is why I asked her. I knew she wouldn't be able to answer that. But I wasn't bothered with the answer. I just wanted to make sure she heard the question.
Yeah.
Deal for me. And I thought it's interesting how that sense of entitlement starts rolling out and how they can respond very badly to one's position. And I think Rini had some of that too. But I wasn't sure. I suppose I wasn't sure whether we were fully supported sometimes. I think that's what I felt. I don't know what it was like for the institution to have 2 Black people as course leads running a course. I'm sure that was very unusual, given the paucity of Black professionals in the Tavistock at that time, because there was only Agnes, Laverne, Frank Lowe, weren't there? I don't know what impact that had on having Rini and I, actually, but I think it helped that Rini was doing a doctorate at the time. I think that did help, because I think she brought a lot of rigour to what needed to be done. And we were the only discipline that did that. I think we were quite radical, perhaps, in those days. Although it was we weren't appointed because we were Black, we were appointed because that's how it was.
Yeah.
But we also happened to be Black.
Yeah.
In those days, like 2009, 2010, bringing up issues of race and culture still felt quite dangerous. And the couple of students who were from minority ethnic backgrounds felt quite marginalized. So I did my best to promote students' writing and thinking, helping students from that year to write articles. So I remember with Jennifer Wallace, we wrote an article about whiteness, and that was her master's dissertation, which was really good. And I think that things had moved on. Now, when I first joined as a trainee, I don't think there was very much thinking about issues of race and culture. And I remember being quite perturbed by this. And when I published my first book, co-authored with Shumita, I was invited by the team to come and share some of the exercises.
So I decided to do M6, which I did for a few years, and it was much more hands-on, much more directly involved with the student. I did pay great attention to the minority ethnic students, the Black students, and some of the struggles that they had on the course. I could see just how deeply affecting some of what goes on in the training is, how it can be, and it goes with students, and it goes with students, their relationship with the institution as well as the tutors. But we are all affected by that, I think. I didn't think of myself as a role model until somebody said to me, was it this cohort, last cohort? She said, somebody I interviewed, and I think when I was there, she said, oh, I came on this course because you were here and I was really sorry that you'd left. And I thought, oh, I hadn't thought about that. I just hadn't thought about it.
Really?
But yeah, I suppose it is a factor. It is a factor. I wasn't sure then the extent to which to highlight issues for Black students, because now that we've had, since Black Lives Matters, it's been much more open. I wasn't sure at that point whether to focus on providing support, more explicit support perhaps, for Black students. I did it individually. Or maybe I was more aware or more in touch with, not so much that, but more about some of the challenges that I might be faced with as a Black course lead. Maybe that I was more in touch with that, expecting that to be an issue perhaps. I was very, I suppose, very keen to make sure I was seen as being professional as possible, because I wanted the reputation of the course to be well respected, and I had to do the things to make that well respected.
The idea that you keep the cross-cultural and the race relations central. It's a parallel struggle because that has all the sort of political sensitivity and indeed, you know, the kind of the guilt and worries and anxieties that all of that brings about whenever you mention it or move about it or demand about it or shout about it, you know. Yeah. And there's the injustice, you know, the injustice of it that really organizes us. And of course, that's important. And it's quite difficult to see how do you put it central in our theories.
A project on families where a parent has a mental illness. I was incredibly lucky to work with Bernadette Wren on that project. And we did find working at that kind of edge between how to absolutely join with parents who were struggling to be the best parents they could, but within the context of their own suffering and their own volatility and their own difficulty in managing some aspects of life, and how we thought about the responsibilities that children often took up in those contexts. And then that's where it links so well with sociology, social thinking, is that whole idea of children as active agents.
It was very much rooted in the work, this Bateson work on communication that had been really present early on in the family therapy field. And relationships, particularly in families, are organised around expectations that parents have of themselves and that society has of parents. A task is that you keep your children safe. A task is that in some sense you get them to imbibe the expectations that you have of them. You take seriously the task of providing comfort, as well as parents being there for fun and to have a good time and to just introduce kids to the world in a very lovely, low-key way. That is fundamentally, in the simplest possible way, the domains model. This seems so achingly relevant to our own circumstances. A way of thinking that kind of nobody's quite at fault here, but there's something that's just mismatching. One of the ways of working was to lay the model out precisely to the families and see what they made of it and see how they would take it up in their own way.
Extremely difficult area of work to work with people where there had been violence, but it had been assessed that there was a chance they could stay together. To engage them around the parenting helped reduce the risk overall between the couple and for the family. And I think some of them that were most memorable was the voice of the children and hearing them speak to the experience. The thing they least want to happen is that the children were aware, were affected, had such clear memories. And for the children to be able to ensure that it's safe enough, as you say, to begin to speak. And what we did to help facilitate that so that they did feel free to speak.
The Institute of Psychoanalysis had these introductory lectures which were for anybody, for the public, and I thought that would be a very good model for family therapy. I developed it with Rini Singh, and it was a very exciting course. So it wasn't just making them accessible to a wider public, it was also bringing in areas where we don't normally, if we're in a clinical context, talk about systems thinking. So for me, the passion has always been how do we use our thinking in much wider spheres. And then it was one of the first courses to be selected for the e-TAVI online. And now, of course, this Families and Beyond online is absolutely taking off, and it's now going to be translated into Mandarin. So who knows what its trajectory will be.
But I don't know if the integration of psychodynamic and systemic went much further than it did when I was working on it in the 80s.
The D24 course, which is about children, young people, families. So really thinking about how you work from a multidisciplinary but also across modalities kind of way of working. And it's been an incredible journey, actually, having those conversations between different approaches, between psychoanalysis and systems in particular, but also with a developmental research perspective and all the developments in neuroscience. And we have arguments sometimes and disputes and differences, but also something that feels very fertile and dynamic, I would say. So we use both and as a way of thinking. And we use the idea of lenses or hats or whatever, and think quite a lot about, are we promoting something that's called a kind of integrated approach? Or are we thinking about different contexts, of thinking about what are we doing and why are we doing it?
It was really shocking how systemic therapy didn't really have any influence across the lifespan, but only with children, when children were referred. And then trying and doing some connections with the people in the adult department around trying to get some of those practices and thinking in there. And it probably wasn't until I did more of the supervision of the young registrars that probably there was an opening for doing more of that, whereas these people were absolutely shocked by some of the things I was asking them to do, and they challenged pretty well everything I said or did, but we had the most wonderful time together.
I think there's something to be said for timing and how we were a little bit unlucky as a discipline. We're at the point when, in 2002, when we become a discipline, it's quite complicated, but we do it. And we're now moving from the margins to the center, but in a very uncertain and not totally secure way. For all the things like Sarah spoke to, there was a sense that we needed to prove ourselves in some way in terms of the context of the organization, that we had a right to be at the table. I think there was a lot of testing, ignoring at times, but also appreciation developing. So we're moving from the margins to the center at the same time as the center begins to change. Because as we find ourselves more in the center, the money begins to disappear, but most importantly, and it's not just austerity, it was a combination of austerity, the Lansley reforms of 2012, the marketization of health services, the fact that contracts became specific, specified, organizing, that the freedom that all those people who have interviewed, who were there in the early days, really was very hard to sustain.
But it is sad that we've had these other developments, which I don't think we can reconcile very easily. The audit, the managerialism, it's very hard to reconcile it with our ways of thinking.
If you haven't got a leader who will embrace systemic ideas, you're limited in how much systemic thinking can influence the organisation. It will only influence the part which is your sphere of influence.
It's been important in our development also to be on the edge, and that we have to take responsibility for being the other in the Tavistock Clinic, and that's been good for us. It's made us a tighter unit, and it's made us fight a little bit harder for our ideas. But it gets, I've been here a long time, and I feel sometimes I just get tired of always having to remind the institution that we're here, or to include our way of thinking in our courses. I think that we had to make a boundary around ourselves in order to survive and to be identified as something separate. And the psychoanalytic community has to do that because they're fighting, in some ways, a tougher battle in the outside world, because psychoanalysis is, as a method of treatment, is under attack. And so this becomes a kind of bastion, a kind of fortress against the outside world, and we represent the outside world for them. Position on the edge, which I like. I feel it's very creative. You can get in and get out, and I think that's what a lot of therapy is about: is getting very close and then stepping back. Sometimes I just step back and I say, amazing. The quality of people that have come through here and what they've learned and what they've gone on to do and how they influence the mental health world.
There is a history here and in this country of our profession, our interests, and it's so important to know that, so that the fluidity of time and development can be kind of viewed, and that helps you think about the future too. I'm looking forward to seeing how it does develop, how our profession develops, how the Tavistock Clinic in the 21st century, which despite the dire financial circumstances, which it does not seem very encouraging, maybe out of this post-COVID, the wish to generate new ways of thinking about mental health. Hopefully the Tavistock will still be an important center for those developments.